Hello, thank you for coming to my channel. If you like my content, I don't often do this, but probably I should. If you like my content, if you like my videos, please do feel free to share and subscribe. Yeah. I guess the reason I don't often say that is it sounds a little bit cliched but yeah, I mean, please do. If you like the channel, please feel free to share and subscribe. Okay, this one's gonna be a little bit philosophical, a little bit, hopefully thought-provoking. And it's about the nature of Cowardice as a concept. Um, this is obviously quite a loaded term, particularly when it is used as a pejorative, when you're criticizing someone. And I'm not going to lie, I've used the term, I have used it towards particular individuals, and that has come from a point where I felt enough contention with the position that person has taken that I feel it was a justified term. So I'm not apologizing for using it, but I do think that there is an onus on me as someone who's used the term to justify, explain how I see it as a term, because it isn't something that should be thrown around. It's a little bit like traitor. Um, it's not to say that these words aren't sometimes valid, but they shouldn't be casually thrown around. So, Cardis. Um, First thing that strikes me is a point that Will Nolan made in his lecture on the patriarchy paradox. This is the lecturer at Eton College, if you're not familiar, who recently got in trouble for offending feminists. But he made an interesting point, which is one that's worth thinking about. When we think of the pejorative, you're a card, it's almost always leveled at men, but even if it is leveled at women, it inevitably has a more forceful dynamic when it's leveled at men. Why? Because historically, throughout most societies, perhaps one or two exceptions, but the vast majority of societies the world over, the onus on physical bravery has been on men, not women. It was always men who were expected to be the hunter gatherers, to be the protectors. That's always been the case, and it still is to some extent. To some extent. Um, One could argue that gender dynamics have changed to such an extent that that's almost invalid. I still think there is unique expectations put on men. However, we live in an era where women can be soldiers, women can be police officers, men can be nurses. So traditional gender roles have become more flexible, and I'm all for that. I'm an egalitarian. I've nothing against that. Um, I wouldn't actually want a situation where there is a stuffy expectation of people having to conform to their whatever perception traditionally the gender would encompass. Having said that, I also think it's went too far the other way insofar as you get these people who, they say that they'll let their children do what they want in terms of like if a little boy wants to play with a doll, the parents will let him. If a little girl wants to play with, I don't know, an action figure, they will let her, and that's fine. But you get, I think, parents going the other way, where if the little boy actually wants to play with action figures or trains or soldiers, whatever it is, then some parents would try to condition him not to be in touch with his masculine side. So the point I would make there, and I'll just say this briefly because I don't want to distract. By the way, the smoke you see is incense, so don't worry about that. It relaxes me. Um, yeah, this idea that if someone is in touch with the masculine side, if a man is in touch with his masculine side, or if a woman is in touch with her feminine side, then these ultra modernists, or for want of a better term, these identitarians who try to make it all about, oh, it's a forced social concept. Well, what are they doing? They're saying that, if someone is actually quite traditional, that's somehow alien or society's forcing them to do it. Has it occurred to them that maybe some women just like shopping and wearing makeup and being feminine in that sense? and some men just like, I don't know, physical activity or boxing, whatever. You see, with me, I'm liberal on this. I think um, live and let live. People could do what they want. I think women should be allowed to do everything men could do on an equal basis. They should be treated the same. So women in the army, etc., should get special treatment, but they should be allowed the opportunities. I think we've come to a point now where we can accept that. Um, there's a bit of actually a grey area if women can go into combat roles. Apparently, across all three forces now, the Navy, Army, and Air Force, women can now do combat roles, and that I think is a relatively recent change. Um, and there were in fact a few women who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, nowhere near as many as male personnel, but there were some, so it does happen. Um, and their sacrifice is very much to be respected. Um, anyway, I didn't mean to detract so much, but it's relevant. It's relevant to where this onus of cowardice is placed, because if you call a man a coward, especially publicly, that's quite a stigma. If you call a woman a coward, I still don't think it quite has the same effect. It's still an insult, but it's not. I don't think it has the same effect. If we look at the attitude to cowardice throughout history, um, a famous example, of course, is the White Feather campaign of the First World War. In this campaign, nationalism was very rife, particularly in the early part of the war, all round in every participating country. So there was this very energetic drive. Prominent public figures like Rudyard Kipling very much supported it. Emmeline Pankhurst put aside her suffragist movement to the side whilst she supported the war effort. The Pankhursts were divided. Sylvia Pankhurst, I believe, was divided from her mother because she was a pacifist. Her mother was quite conservative, actually, ironically. One of the most famous feminists of the 20th century was actually quite conservative. But, you know, they got behind this campaign to sort of encourage the recruitment drive, and part of that was shaming men who were seen to not be serving. Now, there were a few reserved occupations, as there was in the Second World War, but basically, if you were an able-bodied young man and you weren't in the reserved occupation, although sometimes they didn't even bother checking, um, you know, and you weren't on the front line, you would basically be stigmatized as a coward. And this was quite a serious thing. If you were handed the white feather on the street by a woman, and this was a particularly manipulative step, it wasn't other men that handed it out, it was women. The idea being that, when Germany invaded Belgium and there probably was war crimes committed, that was a big part of the Allied propaganda campaign. Like, this is what the Hun will do to our women if given a chance. So, what sort of man are you not to defend your female compatriots? What sort of man are you not to defend your mother, your sister, your wife, and so on? And that was very specifically using women to shame men because they were those who were to be defended. So, would have been less of an impact from other men in a sense. This wasn't actually created out of the First World War. I believe it went back earlier. The story, The Four Feathers, which was also adapted to film, goes back to the Mahdist War of the 1880s, with also known as the Anglo-Sudanese War. Um, and it goes without saying that idea of gender roles, particularly in time of war, definitely predated World War One. But getting back to the issue of Cowardice, I'm sure there's lots of interesting things to say around that. Perhaps for another video. But on the issue of Cowardice, I think there's different ways to look at it. I mean, is physical fear cowardice? If someone, for example, has a phobia about spiders, are they a coward if they don't want to be near a spider? I wouldn't say that, because I reckon most people have some sort of fear of something. So if you're going to label someone a coward because they're being honest about their fear of a particular thing, particularly something common like spiders, then everyone's a coward in a sense. Even some of the bravest people in the world outwardly, you know, it's often said, like, soldiers who've been through war will often say any man who denies that he was scared is a liar or mad. And this is from men who, were at the Battle of the Somme. So most people, I don't care how bravado they are, how outwardly brave they are, will have some fear. Mike Tyson, Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet, he's admitted that he was terrified every time he went into the ring, and yet his whole demeanor often defeated opponents before the fight even went the distance. Um, any prize fighter who says he's not scared is a liar. I mean, to go into that ring in front of thousands of people, this is why it's seen in some ways as the most macho sport. To go into a prize ring in front of thousands of people, because there's that aspect of humiliation as well if you lose badly. Um, and, the risk of being beaten, the risk of going through physical pain. Although most fighters would say they're more concerned about the losing side than the physical pain. But it takes guts. That's why I have a lot of respect for boxers. Some of them I don't particularly care for personality wise, but it takes guts to do that sport. And I do wish that the fans would appreciate that a little bit more sometimes. Um, so that's clearly an example of courage. I was going to say manly courage, but to be fair, there's women fighters as well. Takes courage for them. So there's that dynamic. Courage, of course, being the opposite of cowardice. Um, but then you get situations like, well, if we're going to extend that, let's say you have a street fight situation and a guy walks away because he doesn't want trouble. Is he a coward? Absolutely not. I have a lot of respect actually for men who can rise above it and keep their emotions in control. I remember a few years ago, it was quite a few years ago now, the police, I think it was the Met, had an advertisement about can you be a police officer? And they had Lennox Lewis, the great heavyweight boxer, kind of saying he wasn't sure if he could keep his cool in a situation where it appeared that a man was beating up his wife. Now, that's a situation where you need to have self control. I cited another example recently, Ross Kemp. You know, again, this is a guy who clearly has courage. He's been in war zones. It takes courage to be a frontline reporter. And I mentioned how he had to keep self control when he was interviewing his gang leader who'd raped multiple women. Um, so actually tempering one's emotions, it's partly courage, but also I think takes a lot of self control. But then there's a human dynamic. If you do snap with someone like that, it's a totally human reaction. Um, So there's all these sort of scenarios that people find themselves in where this question comes into play. Uh, I'm very interested in the subject of moral cowardice and moral courage. So, as an example, let's say you have a group dynamic, and let's say there's 20 people in that group. Let's say 15 of them are kind of gossiping about an individual, and it could be a place of work, it could be another dynamic. They're gossiping about that individual, and you know the individual in question, and you think it's unfair, and you think they're being smeared. And one day they're sitting down at the dinner table or whatever it might be, and they sort of bring you into it, like, "Oh, did you hear about this person?" Now, a card in my line of thinking would immediately latch on and say, "Oh yeah, he's a or she's a whatever." A decent person would say, well, I'm not comfortable talking about this person behind their back, and I don't agree with you. I don't think that is the way. Now, I would say that takes a degree of courage. Why? Because you're sticking your neck out to do the right thing, knowing that you could then be turned on, but it's the right thing to do. I think of the film 12 Angry Men when Henry Fonda's character plays one of the jurors who believes that basically, if you haven't seen the film, it's a great film. It's from 1957. I think it's based on a screenplay. But basically, it's about a group of jurors, all men, who have to decide the fate of a young man who's been accused of murdering his father. Now, in the beginning, they're all pretty sure that he's guilty because the evidence seems strong. But Henry Fonda's character says, well, we could be sending a man to the gallows. Let's at least talk about this a bit. Let's debate it out. Spoiler here, if you haven't seen the film, he basically sways all of them, even the most dogged, hardline ones. And that, takes a degree of moral courage because throughout the process he's subject to personal insults. You know, he's told that he is X, Y, and Z, etc. But he just believes it's the right thing to do to talk it out. He's not saying the young man is definitely innocent. He's saying we need to talk it out because it's due process. It's a very interesting film. Actually, one thing about that film, if you're familiar with it, some people have done a critical analysis of this and found that actually, when you look at the information, the young man probably was guilty. But it's the principle of it. It's the principle of arguing this out. There's a few situations. I'm going to put my cards on the table here, which I think are hardly. I believe that group dynamic versus an individual is cardly. If you get a gang who attacks an individual, and to me it's one of the most abhorrent crimes, I think there needs to be much harder sentences. But anyway, you get a gang and they lay into an individual like a pack of hyenas, frankly insulting to hyenas. It's savage, it's primitive, and yes, it's cowardly. Why cowardly? It's cowardly because physically they have no threat. It's not a one-on-one dynamic where they might be injured as well. If there's six of them or more, the individual being attacked has absolutely minimal chance of imposing any counter damage. Even if they're physically tough, it just is impossible. So it's cowardly of them to choose an easy fight. Not that it is a fight, but it's from their point of view. It's there's no risk. That's cowardly. And if I was a judge, I would tell them to their face that they're despicable. They're despicable cowards. That sort of cowardice makes my blood boil. But I also think there's cowardice on issues a bit broader, geopolitical issues. I feel that somebody who, um, for example, serves as an apologist or a cheerleader for a tyranny, whilst they are enjoying the relative freedoms of a country like the UK, um, I believe that is moral cowardice. And the reason I say that is because they are insulting the people who are going through that regime. They are insulting people who have fled from the regime, to escape for their lives, or from political imprisonment or torture, or persecution. And there you have these people who are enjoying the comforts of a relatively free country, yet they're using that to defend the indefensible. Now, to me, that's moral cowardice because people in those countries don't have a choice. So they are using, I suppose you could counter, well, it's a genuine opinion. So is it cowardice? I still would say it is because, I recently read about a French writer who defended the Chinese and claimed that the Uyghur concentration camp didn't exist. Now, people like that, I have zero respect for. Of course, he was elevated in Chinese media because they love a Westerner who stands up for them. Um, but he's a pensioner. He's enjoying retirement in Paris. Comfortable. He's not living in one of these concentration camps. So you also get journalists who I feel very strongly about this, who call themselves freelance journalists, but they basically want to push an anti-West agenda by serving as stooges for totalitarian regimes. Um, to me, that is cowardice because it's taking the easy choice. Now, you might say, well, wait a second, Nathan, they'll get a lot of criticism, so they're sticking their neck out in that sense. But I'm calling it cowardice on the grounds that they're not really doing anything difficult by defending Putin or Assad or the Chinese regime or whoever it might be. They're going to get criticized, and they probably know that they're going to get criticized, but there's no risk involved. They're not going to be thrown in jail or tortured or have their items confiscated or anything like that because they are being anti-West in their worldview. They're going to be criticized. That is not the same risk as, say, a human rights activist takes in those states. So I'm weighing up the courage of, say, for example, young Burmese people who have been massacred versus some useful idiot or moral card. And there I'm saying the word moral card in a country like the UK or France or Canada or the United States, who basically serves as an apologist for those regimes. Frankly, I have zero respect for such people. I don't know whether they're just trying to be a bit edgy and different or whether they really, really do believe it. I don't know what it is. But either way, I think they're wrong. And I think it's moral cowardice because there's no real risk involved. It's the easy thing to do. And it's kind of like if I would make an analogy, if you're a teacher and you see children being bullied or a child being bullied, and you as a teacher join the bullies, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's like which side do you choose? Now, I am not saying that everyone needs to be a superhero. We all need to be all bravado and always stick our neck out. There's times we have to, put ourselves first. There's times that sticking our neck out is reckless. So I wouldn't go to China, for example, and go into a main street and stand up and start saying, "Oh, your government is a dictatorship." Why? Because not only would I be arrested as a foreign spy, I'd probably have an angry mob chasing me. I'm not that brave. I like to think I have a fair degree of pluck. I've been in a boxing ring. I have stuck my neck out on occasion to do what I felt was the right thing. So I know that I've tested myself. But to me, courage is not about always being bravado. There's times, Bruce Lee said something interesting. He said that there are times when running away is the best option. This is Bruce Lee, you know. Um, if you take a street fight dynamic, if you get, some drunks that are throwing insults at you, the human reaction would be to say something back. But street fights, I think, should be avoided for the most part. They're boneheaded. They're primitive. The only circumstance I think it would be justified is if you absolutely have to defend yourself or defend someone you care about. I mean, as a scenario, if I'm walking down the street with a girlfriend and some yob throws a glass bottle at us, I'm not gonna, let that go. Of course not. Why? Not so much for me, but because my lady could have been hurt. And I'm traditional enough to say that. I've no problem saying that. So yeah, I would confront that individual. If they mouthed off at me, I would probably shout something back or maybe ignore it. But I think that there is no cowardice. There's nothing. It doesn't make someone less of a man by avoiding physical confrontation when it's not worth it. It reminds me of a scene in the film Rob Roy, where the main character played by Liam Neeson is challenged to a duel, but he's in a tavern, and the guy who challenges him to a duel is a bit of a loose cannon, a bit of a hothead, and it's a great scene. Rob Roy says, "All right, first blood," and the guy goes, "Aye, aye." So Rob Roy gets his hand, runs it over the sword, and says, "You win." It's it's a good scene, but it shows that sometimes intellect and judging a situation is actually the manly thing to do, and it's a more intelligent and practical thing to do. But I do think it's healthy for all of us to maybe step outside our comfort zone sometimes. Sitting on the fence all the time. I do agree with the principle that if you sit on the fence, you're siding with tyranny. You can't sit on the fence when it comes to the likes of the Chinese regime, in my opinion. And I'm going to round this up soon, but on the issue of cowardice, I also would say that a definition of cowardice would be if someone is in a position of power. This could be a politician, it could be a judge, it could be a powerful newspaper editor, and they do not speak out for what is right. I would say that's cowardly. Now, I've been quite vocal about politicians and others in the West who will not condemn the Chinese regime or seem reluctant to stand up to them. I have said that our university departments are cowardly. I stand by that. What's my justification for that? Well, they're taking money from the Chinese state. They're turning a blind eye to Chinese students bullying their peers. They are basically doing what the Chinese regime wants them to do. They're ignoring what's going on over there. So I think it's moral cowardice. Why? Because they're putting the money that comes in, the investment, ahead of Western values. I think that's cowardly. And I think they should be called out for it. So I have no problem using the term card or cardis, but when I use it, I make damn sure that I have a justification for it. People might disagree, but I won't just throw it out. You get like in boxing, you get hype, you get trash talking. I don't trash talk. If I'm calling someone something, I will have a reason for doing so. I can be abrasive at times. In these videos, I could be quite blunt. Um, I've accused certain judges of being cowardly. Why? Because they haven't issued the maximum sentence available. And to me, it lets down the victim. And I say it's cowardly because they're not using the power they have to do the right thing. But like I say, this is quite an abstract subject. I'd be interested to know, of course, whether you agree or disagree with me, but what is your own perception of cowardice? What is cowardice? To me, it's not fear itself. It's okay to be frightened of things. It's about if you're prepared to stick your neck out or not. And if you never ever do, if you want a totally comfortable life, if you're always sitting on the fence, if you always join the crowd, I would say maybe you're a coward. I would say that, people who, like I've mentioned, for example, those ghastly studio audiences with reality TV. To me, that's the cowardice of a group dynamic because they're jeering at people just because they can. It kind of disgusts me, to be honest. So anyway, let me know your thoughts. This video is a bit longer than I intended, but I do think it's some interesting philosophical standpoints to look at. I'm not saying I'm right about everything, but I think that if I use the term, and I try not to use it often, but there will be times that I use it, the onus is on me to justify why, and that's what I've tried to do in this video. Thanks for watching.